Okay, today's Alexander Inn was known as the guest house back in the construction phase of Oak Ridge, then called the Clinton Engineer Works. And as this historic template indicates, physicists like J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was responsible for the actual bomb construction activities down in New Mexico, and the physicist from Chicago, initially from Italy, Enrico Fermi, and FDR Secretary of War Henry Stimson were among the guests that came here to meet with General Leslie Groves and Colonel Nichols of the Army Corps of Engineers. And this was the place for VIPs to stay in what is now Oak Ridge. And it's one of the few remaining buildings, but it's barely remaining because it needs a lot of updating and restorative work. As you can probably see behind me, the Alexander Inn today is awaiting restoration and eventual approval by the National Historic Trust. So somebody who knows a lot about the National Historic Trust and historic properties generally is Bill Westcott, and he might comment a little bit about this property, but also then remembering some other anecdotes from his childhood living in Knoxville, Tennessee nearby.
Hey, thanks, Phil. Yeah, these signs are very helpful, and I've been active as a preservation consultant for years. But it's important to realize that there are very few buildings like this, historic buildings like this, left in Oak Ridge. One of the things the Corps of Engineers did was they weren't too preservation historic minded, so they thought it was easier to kind of bulldoze something and then put something new on that site. And so eternal vigilance kind of a thing. We need to preserve whatever we can preserve, including these brothers. We had to preserve each other. One of the things I was telling you guys earlier was as a child growing up in this part of the country, my mother, Genevieve, among other things, of course, she was trying to teach me how to tell time. And so each 3 or 4 times a week she'd say, these are the numbers, and this is the big hand, and this is the little hand, and those kind of things. And then we'd go into town, and the big drink at the time, even though Coca-Cola was pretty big, but as a kid I remember Dr. Pepper. And I still drink Dr. Pepper to this day, probably because of that. But the advertising for Dr. Pepper had this big clock face, and a great big one. And they were trying to get you to drink Dr. Pepper 3 times a day, at 10, and at 2, and at 4. So instead of having all 12 numerals on the clock where my mother's trying to teach me how to tell time, it was just 3 numerals, 10, 2, and 4. So I got pretty confused about the fact that these clocks didn't have all the numbers on them, and that worried me that these Dr. Pepper clocks didn't have all those numbers on them. And the other thing is that back to the society kind of a thing, as I mentioned earlier, it was very much of a priority for the war effort to have a victory garden. And everybody's encouraged to have a victory garden in their backyard and grow whatever crops, and you could live off your land, hopefully. But the victory gardens were really important, and the whole war effort was something that people really joined together to support whatever they could do during World War II. So people were very unified as far as doing what they had to do in World War II.
Thanks for that reflection and recollection.